It's estimated that in World War I, 17 to 20 million people lost their life. World War II, the estimates are the range somewhere between 60 and 80 million, because we just don't know, for instance, how many people Stalin starved to death or killed. In our lifetime, we've seen horrific genocides like Cambodia and Rwanda. In the last 15 years, we've seen a tsunami take 230,000 people in Indonesia, 18,000 people in Japan in 2011. Okay, these are current events. And this is what people call the problem of evil. The problem of evil is the idea that given that these awful, devastating things happen in the world, there cannot be a loving heavenly God who sovereignly oversees and ordains the events of this world. The world cannot put those two concepts together. Either there is no God, which would make the most sense, or if there is a God, he is inherently evil and not to be worshipped, or so pathetically weak, there is no point in believing him in the first place. The problem of evil, for many, in the minds of many, just stands as an insurmountable obstacle to faith in the Christian God, the biblical God. The world doesn't have a category for Revelation chapter 6. For a lamb who was slain to redeem sinners for God, and that lamb, in his authority and power, that lamb authorizing and permitting these horrific events to happen in the world. Unfortunately, the church is also losing the category of Revelation chapter 6. One of my chief concerns with modern American Christianity is its shallow understanding of God. And you can take that from the outrageous, right, far edge of the health, wealth gospel to sort of the center of evangelicalism, where Jesus is a life coach and God just loves me, moral therapeutic deism. God's a nice God who wants me to be a nice person, and he exists to help me. So in that realm, you see, there's no category for Revelation 6. There's no category for real suffering and widespread tragedy such as these four horsemen symbolize. If you really believe that God exists to give you your best life now, and millions of Americans believe that in one fashion or another, and maybe even in our own hearts we have that in mind, that God really is intending to give us the best life possible here and now. If that is your God, then you will inevitably think that God has failed you when your life plunges into disaster and suffering. When World War III breaks out, you won't have a category, you see, for a God who actually intends and ordains these events. As your loving Father and your reigning Jesus. You see, we have to, Revelation 6 forces us to rethink the way we think about God and the way we think about tragedies. So what if the violence, take the problem of evil, okay? What if the violence and disasters that we see in the world were not evidences of God's absence, but were evidences of his presence? What if they were precisely God at work in the world, judging this world? So what if they're not signs of his apathy, as people so quickly assume, but instead signs of his just wrath? And what if these things happen not because God doesn't care about his creation, but because he cares with a love and a vengeance that we cannot fathom, and therefore is committed with all of his holy fervor to wipe out what is evil, to punish evildoers? This vision, you see, friends, calls us to read our headlines from a different perspective. This vision is meant to guard your heart from unbelief and despair when trial and tragedy happens. Because this vision shows us, you see, that the evil and the wickedness and this suffering in the world is not just evidence of a world at war with God, but God at war with a world in order to redeem it. We have examples of that in Scripture, don't we? Pharaoh, think of mighty Pharaoh, right? The ruler of Egypt. And Moses comes and says, God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, well, not going to do it. Or then he'll say yes and then change his mind no. And 10 times, over and over, rebelliously, in flagrant violation of God's revealed will, and in the face of the experiences of God's wrath in the plagues, Pharaoh will not let the people go. No one, you see, can deny then that when God destroys Pharaoh's army, every last man of them in the Red Sea, that God is acting in divine justice, and that God has ordained the evil of Pharaoh to be the destruction of Pharaoh and the deliverance of Israel. It's a completely different way of thinking about human history. It's a way of thinking about human history that actually has a God in heaven who knows exactly what he's about. Now we can say, okay, well that's a long time ago. And maybe several tens of thousands died. What do you do at the World War II? 80 million killed. 230,000 in a day killed in Indonesia by a tsunami. I mean, those sorts of numbers and that reality will stagger you if you have a vision of a small God who exists to do the best he can to give you the best possible experience in the few short years that you have here in this world. But what if it's not like that? What if God is so glorious and that the rebellion of man, the creature, is then so weighty in its offense and so incredibly evil that world wars and tsunamis are a just and appropriate response? You see, Revelation 6 forces us to consider that God is vastly greater and more glorious and more worthy of worship and honor than we had ever conceived, and that consequently our sin is vastly more awful than that his judgments then against this wicked world, as awful as those judgments are actually truly just.